Zelenskyy invites leaders to Trump talks. EU turns up the heat, tougher sanctions and more aid for Ukraine. Russia's shadow fleet fuels hybrid war. How is it happening? Here's the latest, so you will be in focus. Subscribe and stay tuned. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, supports the participation of European leaders in a meeting with US President Donald Trump. The head of state said this at a coalition of the willing meeting. According to him, negotiations with the American side are already being prepared. However, sensitive issues remain that require broad international support. Zelenskyy stressed that having European representatives present could strengthen Ukraine's position and help in finding balanced solutions. While Russia rejects all peaceful efforts, sanctions against the aggressor state must be strengthened, and defense and financial support for Kyiv must continue. This was stated on the website of the Office of the President of Ukraine following a telephone conversation between Volodymyr Zelenskyy and the President of the European Commission. A key priority for the EU is a peace agreement that will ensure real security for Ukraine and Europe, Ursula von der Leyen emphasized during her address in the European Parliament. More details will be provided by Victoria Chestukhina.
Russia shows no readiness to end the war against Ukraine. Therefore, pressure on the aggressor must continue, stated the President of the European Commission. And the main principle in working on a peace agreement should be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine and nothing about Europe without Europe, emphasized Ursula von der Leyen.
The first priority is that any agreement should deliver a just and lasting peace. And it should ensure real security for Ukraine and Europe. As a sovereign nation, there can be no limitations on Ukraine's armed forces that would leave the country vulnerable to future attacks. And this is as much about deterrence as it is about Europe's security, because Ukraine's security is Europe's security. So Ukraine needs robust, long-term and credible security guarantees.
The European Union demands from Moscow the return of all Ukrainian children abducted by Russia, insists on the inviolability of Ukraine's sovereignty, and will continue to support Kyiv. Ukraine's future is in the European Union, and this is the main and essential part of any security guarantees system, stated the President of the European Commission. Any decisions concerning Ukraine and Europe can only be made with their consent. Other options are unacceptable, emphasized German Chancellor Friedrich Merz.
Putin must realize that he has no chance to win this war at the cost of European freedom and peace. This is the guiding principle of our policy, particularly regarding Ukraine. We want this war to end as soon as possible, but an agreement reached without Ukraine's consent and without the Europeans' consent will not be the basis for a genuine and lasting peace in Ukraine. Therefore, the unity of Europe, unity with Ukraine, and unity of the transatlantic alliance are of decisive importance now.
To increase the chances of peace, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy is convinced that pressure on Russia must be intensified. Kaja Kallas called on allies to accelerate work on sanctions against Russia and mechanisms for financing Ukraine, including through a reparations loan using frozen Russian assets. The European Union will make a significant contribution to providing security guarantees for Ukraine, the diplomat assured.
But security guarantees to Ukraine do not change the fact that the threat really here is Russia. In last 100 years, Russia has attacked more than 19 countries, some as many as 3 or 4 times. None of these countries has ever attacked Russia. So in any peace agreement, we have to put the focus on how to get concessions from Russian side, that they stop aggression for good and do not try to change borders by force. There are rarely wars in the world where the situation is so clear-cut as it is here. We have one aggressor and one victim. The focus should be on what Russia, the aggressor, must do, not what Ukraine, the victim, must sacrifice.
Europe will be involved in security guarantees for Ukraine that are being considered as part of the U.S. peace plan to end the war, stated President Donald Trump.
Over the past week, my team has made tremendous progress with respect to ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. The original 28-point peace plan, which was drafted by the United States, has been fine-tuned with additional input from both sides, and there are only a few remaining points of disagreement. I look forward to hopefully meeting with President Zelenskyy and President Putin soon. but only when the deal to end this war is final or in its final stages. Donald Trump, President of the United States, on Truth Social.
But right now, Putin only imitates readiness for the negotiation process. Analysts believe
For Russia, any peace plan is extremely unfavorable. That is, they can play at imitation. They thought Ukraine would not be ready for a full negotiation process, although Ukraine has repeatedly emphasized its readiness for such a process. And accordingly, the war, because Putin has repeatedly stated in recent days that the war will continue. Why? Because he believes he has enough resources for mass killings in Ukraine.
Heads of foreign affairs committees of 20 European parliaments issued a joint statement supporting Ukraine's position on achieving peace. At the same time, they warned against a peace agreement that could play into the Kremlin's hands. This was reported on November 24th by the head of the Estonian Foreign Affairs Committee of the Riigikogu, Mark Michelson. Parliamentarians emphasized that concessions to the aggressor will only make a new war more likely. Reported by Victoria Chistyukina, UATV News.
Russia is increasingly using its Shadow fleet as a tool of hybrid warfare against Europe, writes Foreign Affairs. As a result, the maritime space around Europe is turning into a key arena for pressure in NATO countries. The European Union insists on tightening sanctions against the Russian Shadow fleet. This includes not only the vessels themselves, but also the companies that register them, insure them, and provide logistical services. How Russia uses its Shadow fleet for hybrid attacks, Kristina Dombrovska reports.
Experts from the Danish investigative agency Danwatch have analyzed the connection between numerous violations of airspace over Poland, Romania, Denmark, Germany, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and the activity of Russia-linked vessels in the Baltic Sea. We are talking about ships of Russia's Shadow fleet. Moscow uses them for intelligence operations and hybrid attacks in Europe and other countries, analysts claim.
Drone operation, however, requires some degree of specialized training. In this sense, Russian-linked vessels can provide both effective cover for Russian agents and convenient launch platforms for drones of limited range. As a result, the Shadow fleet has taken on new importance in Russia's hybrid warfare in Europe. If European leaders hope to curtail Putin's increasingly bold hybrid warfare strategy, they will need to adopt a much firmer approach to the Shadow fleet, from a publication by Foreign Affairs.
On November 19th, UK Defense Secretary John Healey stated that the research vessel Yantar, belonging to the Russian Ministry of Defense, had entered British territorial waters in recent weeks. The vessel's crew used laser systems against British Royal Air Force Boeing P-8 Poseidon anti-submarine patrol aircraft. Healey called such actions extremely dangerous. He emphasized that the UK is preparing various response options in case of escalation by Russia, and announced the opening of a new factory for producing maritime and underwater drones.
And this is the second time this year that this ship, the Yantar, has deployed to UK waters. So my message to Russia and to Putin is this. We see you, we know what you're doing, and if the Yantar travels south this week, we are ready.
Against the backdrop of growing threats in the Baltic Sea and increased Russian-Chinese shipping along the Arctic route, the Swedish government has initiated a program to procure 4 frigates, reports Global Defense News.
The Baltic Sea has become an unpredictable and contested area because Russia conducts hybrid underwater operations. There have been suspected sabotage incidents and the deployment of unmanned systems and continuous electronic interference. Sweden requires its future frigate class to protect critical infrastructure and enhance operational awareness, from a publication by Global Defense News.
In general terms, I would say that the Baltic Sea has never been more challenged than it is today. On the other hand, it has never been more protected than it is today, and never in a more joint way than it is today. We cooperate in the air, we cooperate on the surface, we definitely act under the surface as well. So I would say that we have never been more in control of the Baltic Sea, and that annoys the Russians, obviously.
Europe already possesses the necessary legal tools to counter suspicious shipping in its waters. These mechanisms give EU member states considerable freedom of action. The problem is not the legislation itself, but its fragmented and hesitant application, analysts believe.
Member states should jointly pressure permissive flag registries that enable rapid flag hopping and fictitious identities. Since many of these vessels repeatedly shift between registries, Russia's shadow fleet will not disappear on its own. It represents a structural vulnerability Moscow will exploit as long as enforcement remains inconsistent. Chris Kremidis-Courtney, Senior Visiting Fellow at the European Policy Center, from a report by European Policy Center.
The European Union has banned access to its ports for vessels engaged in ship-to-ship cargo transfers. And although such measures complicate the export of Russian oil and gas, they are unlikely to prevent sabotage operations that do not require port access. If Europe wants to protect its maritime infrastructure and limit military financing of the aggressor country, it must act decisively and put an end to the impunity of the aggressor country's shadow fleet, the European Policy Center is convinced. Reported by Kristina Dombrovska, UATV News.
What's your take on all this? Share your thoughts below. This is UATV. Stay sharp, in focus, and stay safe.